All right, over the last few days, we've been going over fire regimes. I've been slowly working my way through Chapter 5 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. I'm basically at the end now. And I've been spending so much time on fire regimes because they're so important to understanding how to actually help solve this wildfire problem in California. So before I get into that, first question I should answer is, what is a fire regime? So a fire regime is the typical fire that you see within an area. And this could have evolved over hundreds to if not thousands of years. And the type of fire that you have in the area is going to impact the type of fuels or the type of plants that you have in an area. And it almost works both ways. Your fire impacts your plants, and your plants impact your fire. So it's almost like a balanced scale. So that's why if you're trying to help an ecosystem in California by influencing fire, you actually want to mimic what the natural fire regime is in that area. Otherwise, you might tilt that scale and you might introduce something that isn't natural to that environment. It might be true somewhere else, but maybe not for this specific place. And then it might not be what the plants are adapted to, and you might end up hurting the environment that you actually hope to help. So understanding fire regimes is very important because, if you don't, you might think you're going to help an environment and you actually end up wiping out the entire environment. So there's three main characteristics that you need to know about fire regimes. It's temporal, spatial, and magnitude. Now, over the last 2 days, we've gone over temporal and spatial, so I'm not going to spend too much time on those today. Today, we're mostly going to be going into magnitude, but I'll just do a brief refresher. So temporal, it's basically a fancy way of saying time. We're talking about our seasonality. So what type of year you typically have fire in this area? Do you normally have spring and summer fires, or summer and fall fires, or maybe just the end of summer? That's your seasonality, and that will have some impacts on the plants that you see in that ecosystem. And then also within temporal, we have fire return interval. So do you get fires every 5 to 15 years, like up in the Sierra, where we have lots of thunderstorms and lots of lightning, so that influenced the plant communities up there and the adaptations they have to fire? Or is it going to be like the chaparral on the Central Coast, which had very infrequent fire ignitions as those plants were evolving? So they're more adapted to fire maybe every 50 years, and that's changed their adaptations. So just a quick example, if you were to take what would be good for the Sierra and try to put that in place for the chaparral, like putting in prescribed fire every 5 years, that would actually wipe out the entire chaparral. And that was the key lesson that I learned about why fire regimes are so important, which is a big part of the reason I spent the last few days really diving into this topic. So that's temporal, seasonality, fire return interval. Next is spatial. I talked about this yesterday. Spatial is going to be your fire size and your spatial complexity. So fire size is like your fire perimeter and everything inside of that. It's technically different than your burned area because within your fire perimeter, a lot of the time, not everything is burned. You can have an unburned area next to an area that had high severity burn where everything's gone. Then maybe there's another patch that had low severity, so maybe a mix of burnt and unburnt. And the smaller those little patches are, or the more complex that mosaic is, the higher your spatial complexity is going to be. And as you guessed it, that's going to have impacts on the type of plants that you have in that ecosystem and the adaptations that they have evolved over time. So that's temporal and spatial. Finally, we are going to go into magnitude. And hopefully I can do this one correctly because I'm not going to lie, it's pretty complex. There's lots of different things to remember for magnitude. So this is probably my 8th or 9th take on this video. This better be the one where I nail it. But the three big aspects of magnitude are going to be fireline intensity, fire severity, and fire type. Now your first question might be intensity and severity. That kind of sounds like the exact same thing, but there are some differences there that I'll get into. So first, let's go into fireline intensity. For that one, just think of your flame lengths. So from the base of the fire to the tip of the tallest flame, that's going to be your flame lengths. and then the amount of energy that's coming off of the fire, or the amount of heat that's coming off of the fire. That's going to be your fireline intensity. Lots of things that could impact that. It could be things like your temperature, your wind. If you have more wind, more oxygen is going to be supplied, so that would kick up intensity. But the big one is what's going on with your fuels. What kind of fuels do you have? How dry are your fuels? Are they continuous, both horizontally and vertically? And then what type of fuels do you have? But then topography is also important there. If you're going uphill, you're going to have higher intensity fire than if you're going downhill. So it's a lot of the different physics of fire that we've talked about are going to impact the intensity of the fire. So within intensity, we have 4 categories. It is low, moderate, high, and then mixed. So low intensity, that's going to be flame lengths less than 4 feet. And that's going to be something that firefighters could actually just use hand tools to kind of be at the head of the fire fighting it, because it's not that intense. So an example of a low intensity fire would be like something that goes through grasslands, or maybe a Douglas fir forest that has a very short fire return interval, so the fuels haven't had that long to accumulate. So then when another fire comes through there, it just kind of goes along the ground. And yeah, so that's your low intensity. Your moderate intensity is going to be flame lengths 4 to 8 feet. And this is going to be where your firefighters aren't going to be at the head of the fire with their hand tools on that. That's a bit too much heat. That's a bit too much energy. They're going to have to use some other strategies for that one. And environments where you'd see moderate intensity, that could be like in a giant sequoia forest where you have a long fire return interval, and maybe those fuels have been able to accumulate a bit more. So then you're going to have flame lengths between 4 to 8 feet. And then you also have high intensity. High intensity is going to be your most extreme kind of fire. The most heat coming off of it is going to be flame lengths greater than 8 feet. There's not a chance you're going to have people at the head of the fire with hand tools on this one. And that's going to be something like that burns in the chaparral, or I believe coast live oak can also have very high intensity fires. Where, yeah, then you kind of get the picture of what is low intensity versus high intensity. But then you can also have a mix between the two, where maybe you have more frequent surface fires that come through at a low intensity, but then every 50 years, maybe you have a crown fire that comes through at very high intensity. So within the same ecosystem, you can actually have multiple fire intensities that are typical to that environment. And that is going to have some impact on your fuels, because your fuels are going to need to be adapted both to the low intensity and the high intensity fires. So they're going to need to match their environment if they hope to survive there. And then if we were putting fire in that area, then we would want to match that as well, because we want to provide as much of a natural environment as possible, because that's what the plants, you could almost say that's what the plants like. So that's intensity. It's already farther than I got in most of the first 8 takes of this video. Now let's get into fire severity. So the reason severity is different than intensity is mostly about the flame lengths and the energy and the heat on the fire. Fire severity is more about the impact that it has on vegetation. Or not just vegetation, it can also be the impact it has on the soil, maybe your wildlife habitat, property, or just human life or animal life as well. So it's going to be more of the impact of the fire than the fire itself. So with fire severity, that's also going to be broken up into very similar categories: low, moderate, high, very high severity, and then mixed. So low severity, that's going to be something that goes through maybe your grasses, but it doesn't kill any of your mature plants. And then moderate severity, that's going to, again, maybe it starts to take out a couple of the mature plants, but it's still going to leave most of the environment not completely destroyed. And then high severity, that's where you start to see a bit more of burnt landscape. And that's where with high severity, it almost looks like everything is burned, but your plants that have adapted to that high severity environment will actually still resprout after a high severity fire. And I think this was the coolest thing that I thought about in this chapter as I was reading it is, remember I talked about how the fires impact the plants, but then the plants impact the fires. So it's a balancing act there. And it started to make me question of, okay, do we have high severity fire and then that burns all our plants? Or is it more that the plants actually like that high severity fire? No, so let me explain that again, because that wasn't the best explanation. It's basically saying perhaps the plants, some of their adaptations actually lead to more severe fire. So for that, I'll use an example. Chamise is one of those plants where it can look like it's completely burned after a fire. It looks like the top is gone, but then it's able to resprout after the fire. And chamise is a very flammable plant. But what I'm thinking is perhaps chamise is flammable on purpose because it wants a high severity fire to burn everything else out, because it knows it's adapted to resprouting. It builds up a seed bank in the soils, and those seeds germinate and resprout after a fire comes through when all the competition is cleared out. And then it also has a burrow underneath the ground, which is a store of resources, and then that resprouts after the fire. So it's almost like the chamise plant has natural defenses, like its seed bank and its burrow. But perhaps the reason chamise burns so intensely, that was the example I used for a high intensity fire, is actually almost like an offensive property, where it's promoting high severity fire to burn everything else out, because it knows it's going to be able to survive that high severity fire, whereas a lot of other plants that aren't as well adapted won't be able to. So hopefully I put that forward idea well enough for you to kind of grasp what I'm trying to say there, but it's a very interesting thought that maybe high severity fire, when we think, oh, that just wiped out the whole ecosystem, maybe the plants in that ecosystem were actually promoting that kind of fire on purpose, if you can use that kind of human-like language. So again, high severity, everything looks like it's burned, but your mature plants are still going to resprout. And then very high severity is where your plants actually just burn out. It's such a high severity fire, it's maybe burned so intensely that there's not as much resprouting afterwards. Everything's just pretty much wiped out after that. So as with the intensity one, you can also have mixed here, where sometimes maybe you have low severity, sometimes maybe you have high severity, maybe it has some spatial complexity within your environment. But the most likely one, yeah, I think that's enough on severity. Let's get into the last one. The last one is going to be your fire type. Now, there are a few different types of fires. You've probably heard some of this lingo, especially if you've watched some of my previous videos. I think it was in chapter 4 this came up. You can have ground fires, which is kind of like smoldering. Surface fires, that's where the front is going through. And then crown fires, that's when it gets up into the canopy. Now, for fire type within magnitude, within fire regimes, we don't as much care about ground fires. It's more about surface and crown fires. And there's actually multiple types of crown fire. You have passive, active, and independent. So your first category of fire type within magnitude, within fire regimes, is going to be surface to passive crown fire. So your surface fire is going to be the one that goes along the ground. And then a passive crown fire is going to be one where there's individual torching of trees, but it's not actually moving within the canopy. It's not moving from one tree top to the next and turning into a full-on crown fire. It's a passive crown fire where you have some individual torching. Now the next one is going to be passive to active torching. So that's where or passive to active crown fire. So that's where you have some torching on individual trees, but then this is where you can start to get into an active crown fire, which means it's connected with the surface fire below, and it's moving with the surface fire below, and it's moving within the canopy. So it's going from tree to tree. And that's the most common type of crown fire, typically within California. Although I'd imagine most of these start as the passive crown fires, and then it kind of escalates into active. But it's definitely more common than the independent crown fire. So the independent crown fire, that's going to be our last stage or category here, where it's active to independent. That's where maybe it starts moving up in the trees connected to the surface fire, but then it can actually even become disconnected. So this is where your surface fire is maybe still moving along the ground, but your fire within the crowns moving among the canopy and the trees can be just moving independent of that surface fire below. And it's usually going to be moving faster because up above the trees you have higher winds, whereas the wind is a little bit blocked closer to the surface. And that's going to be a pretty intense fire, but luckily that one's pretty rare. And then finally, you can have a mix of these where, it's surface, then you get some passive, then some active, then maybe a little independent. And that's going to be the different types of fire that you could have in an environment. So that pretty much wraps up magnitude right there. Just a refresher, we talked about intensity, severity, and type. But then, again, the larger refresher, temporal, spatial, magnitude. And then let's see if I still remember all 7 within there to categorize your fire regimes, really just bringing home this fire regime lecture that we've been on for the last few days. So then temporal, it is seasonality, fire return interval. Within spatial, it's going to be fire size and spatial complexity. And then within magnitude, it's going to be fireline intensity, fire severity, and fire type. Now, all of those things mixed together with all the different nuances and complexities is going to determine the types of plants that you have in an ecosystem. But it's also the plants in that ecosystem that are going to determine what kind of fire regime you have. So it's very interconnected. But it's crucial to understand, because if you actually want to do what's best in terms of fire in California, which is returning us more to a natural environment as much as we can. Obviously, we still want to protect life and property out there, but our current mindset of fire suppression at all costs, or put out fires as quickly as possible, or fire is dangerous, or fire is the enemy, that kind of mindset just leads to the accumulation of fuels. And in the future, things are just going to get hotter and drier. There's going to be more people moving into the wild-urban interface, which means there's more property to be destroyed. There's more lives that could be lost. There's also more ignitions that would happen. Although more ignitions might actually help us, because that would lead to more fires which could clear out the fuels. But we don't just want a bunch of fires popping up randomly. What we want is to be able to kind of pick and choose when fire happens. So when a fire is too close to a community, or it's putting lives at risk, we have our advanced tools to be able to put it out, whether it's AI cameras that spot the fire and we put it out before it gets big, or it's the model simulations that predict exactly how the fire is going to burn so we know what kind of strategies to use on it. Those are the fires we want to put out, but where we need to shift our mindset is into the idea that we actually want to be putting more fire on the ground when conditions are favorable. But when we put fire on the ground, we want to be mimicking the natural fire regime, because that's what the plants in that environment have evolved with. So just like if you have a plant, I have this problem all the time, and you water it too much, or maybe you don't water it enough. I usually err on the side of forgetting that I have plants, I don't water them, and then they die. That's the exact same as putting too much fire in an ecosystem, or putting not enough fire in an ecosystem. And it's just going to depend on the different specific localized fire regime that you're talking about. So in one area, maybe the answer is prescribed fire every 5 years. In another area, maybe it's prescribed fire every 70 years. And then as that fuel accumulates throughout that time, we just have to build in fuel breaks around it. And that's the best solution in that specific area. So that's what I've been learning about fire regimes. I think that was a very interesting section. Hopefully I was able to communicate these ideas well enough on my 9th take of the day. I'm going to do another summary on chapter 5 tomorrow and kind of put forward these ideas once again. So if you want to stay tuned for that, you can continue to watch or listen to these videos. And then I'll be done with chapter 5 and I'll continue to work my way through this monster of a book. So yeah, if you want to learn more about wildfire, stay tuned, and thanks for watching.